In the summer of 480 BC, the army of Xerxes was marching west through Macedonia when something came out of the hills at night and began killing the camels. It happened repeatedly, over several nights, in open country between the rivers, and it was strange enough that Herodotus wrote it down decades later and went out of his way to explain the details. The animals came down out of the high ground after dark. They ignored the men. They ignored the pack horses. They went, specifically and consistently, for the baggage camels carrying provisions, and they killed them and nothing else, which puzzled the Persians because there was easier prey standing right beside them. Herodotus was clear about what they were, and he was clear about where they lived. Lions, he wrote, were found in that part of Europe between the river Nestus and the river Achelous, and nowhere further west or east on the continent. He treated it as ordinary geography. He expected his readers to know it, because in the 5th century BC, there were lions in Europe, not in a menagerie, not shipped in for a spectacle. Wild lions, breeding, hunting, living in the hills of what is now northern Greece and Bulgaria and North Macedonia, close enough to a marching army that they came down at night and took the camels out of the middle of it. Aristotle, writing about a century later, confirmed the same population and noted that it was becoming scarce. By around the time of the Roman Empire, it was gone entirely, and the last lion in Europe had died somewhere in the Balkans without anyone recording when or where. That was 480 BC, but the story of the lion begins more than 1,000,000 years before Herodotus, and for most of that time, this was not an African animal at all. It was very nearly a global one. The lion evolved in Africa, and the current evidence points to something on the order of 1 to 2 million years ago for the modern species. What it did next is the part that changes how you see the animal. It spread across Africa, north into the Middle East and Arabia, east through Persia into India, and northwest into Europe. A closely related form, the cave lion, ranged across the entire northern belt of Eurasia, from Britain and Spain to Siberia, and crossed the land bridge into North America. Another form, the American lion, spread down through the continent and as far as Peru. At its greatest extent, the lion and its immediate relatives occupied a range covering most of Africa, most of Eurasia, and most of the Americas. Very few land mammals have ever managed anything close to that. Human beings are one of them. And human beings and lions were living in the same landscape for the entire time our species was becoming what it is now. Not as neighbors, as competitors, hunting the same herds, over the same ground, at the same hours. Which is why the very oldest art human beings ever made is full of them. In a cave at Chauvet, in southern France, there is a panel drawn somewhere in the region of 30 to 36,000 years ago, showing a pride of lions in the act of hunting. There are dozens of animals on that wall. They are drawn in profile, overlapping, moving in the same direction, with their heads low and their shoulders forward and their eyes fixed, and the anatomy is correct in a way that only comes from watching. Whoever drew that had seen lions hunt, more than once, and had stood close enough to be certain about how the muscle sits over the shoulder blade when the animal is stalking. That panel is one of the oldest surviving works of art on Earth, and its subject is lions. But the oldest object of all is stranger than that. In a cave in southern Germany, archaeologists recovered hundreds of fragments of mammoth ivory, which, reassembled over decades, formed a standing figure about a foot tall. It has a human body. It has human legs and shoulders and arms held against its sides. It has the head of a lion. The Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel is roughly 40,000 years old, and it is the earliest known sculpture of something that does not exist. Before this, human beings carved animals they had seen. This is the first surviving object where somebody imagined a thing that was not in the world and then made it. And the thing they imagined was a person who was also a lion. That is where the entire history of this animal actually starts, not with hunting it and not with fearing it, But with the fact that the first time our species reached for an idea bigger than what was in front of it, the shape that idea took was a lion. Everything that follows is a variation on that, because the lion was never domesticated. It is one of the very few large animals that human civilizations lived beside for thousands of years and never turned into livestock, never bred for work, never made useful. The horse was ridden, the camel was loaded, the pigeon was flown. The lion was never anything but itself. So it became something else instead. It became the standard symbol of power in every single civilization that had one within its borders, apparently without any of them needing to be told. In Mesopotamia, the goddess Inanna, and later Ishtar, is shown standing on lions or flanked by them. The Ishtar Gate of Babylon was faced with rows of them in glazed brick, and enough of it survives that you can stand in front of it in a museum today and see exactly what a visitor approaching the city was meant to feel. In Egypt, Sekhmet was a lioness, and she was the goddess of both plague and healing, which is a precise piece of thinking about what a lion actually is. The Sphinx has a lion's body. The pharaoh was described as a lion in inscription after inscription. In Greece, the first labor of Heracles was to kill a lion, and the reason it was first is that it established what kind of being he was. He could not cut its hide, so he strangled it, and afterward he wore the skin. Every image of Heracles for the next 2,000 years shows him wearing a lion. In India, in Persia, in China, in Africa, the same association appears again and again, with no coordination between them, because it was not a cultural choice. It was the obvious conclusion available to anyone who had ever seen the animal. And the clearest expression of what that association actually meant survives in stone, and it is not comfortable to look at. In the 7th century BC, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal had the walls of his palace at Nineveh carved with a sequence of scenes showing a royal lion hunt. Those panels are now in the British Museum, and they are among the finest works of art the ancient world produced. They also show, when you look at them properly, something that was not a hunt. The lions are released from wooden crates. A boy is visible in a small protective cage, lifting the door of a box to let the animal out. The king is in a chariot or on foot in an open space. The lions come out of the boxes into an enclosure and are killed, one after another, with arrows and spears and a sword, in front of an audience. The carving is extraordinary because the Assyrian artists were not sentimental and were not trying to flatter the lions, and yet the animals are the most alive thing on the wall. There is a lioness whose spine has been severed by an arrow. Her hind legs are dead behind her. She is dragging herself forward on her front legs with her mouth open. It is one of the most exact observations of an animal in agony in the whole of ancient art, and it was made by someone standing there watching it happen so that a king could be shown winning. That was the point. The king was not demonstrating courage. He was demonstrating that the most powerful force in the natural world could be put in a box, taken out of the box, and killed on command in the middle of a city. That is what the lion meant, and it explains everything that Rome did next. If you are enjoying this story, take 1 second and hit subscribe, because there is a new deep dive like this every week, and you will not want to miss the next one. The Romans took the Assyrian idea, removed the religion from it, and turned it into an industry. The staged animal hunts of the Roman arena, the venationes, ran for centuries and consumed animals on a scale that is difficult to hold in the mind. In 55 BC, Pompey staged games in Rome that Pliny the Elder later described, and the figure Pliny gives for the lions killed is around 600 in a matter of days. At those same games, something happened that is worth knowing, because it is the one moment in the entire record where the audience broke. Pompey had also brought in elephants. When the elephants were attacked and began to die, they made noises that the crowd found unbearable, and according to Cicero, who was in the audience and wrote about it in a letter, the mood turned. The spectators felt pity, and then they turned that pity into anger, and the anger was directed at Pompey for having done it. Cicero was not a sentimental man, and he was fairly dismissive of the whole business, but he recorded it. Nobody, in any surviving account, ever felt that way about the lions. When the Colosseum opened in 80 AD, the inaugural games ran for 100 days, and the ancient figure given for animals killed in that period is around 9,000. Those numbers should be treated with some caution, because Roman writers were not careful with statistics and had reasons to exaggerate. But even discounted heavily, the scale is not in question, because the supply operation behind it is documented in a way the body counts are not. Capturing lions alive and moving them to Rome was a trade. It required trappers, holding pens, overland transport, ships fitted for live cargo, and feeding along the way, and it ran continuously for centuries out of North Africa and the Near East. Roman mosaics survive showing the process. Imperial officials were assigned to it. Provinces were expected to supply, and it worked. It emptied the coast. The lion populations of North Africa, of Libya and Tunisia and Algeria were pushed back from the Mediterranean and up into the mountains during the Roman centuries, and they never came back down. Syria and Asia Minor lost their lions in the same period. This is one of the earliest large-scale regional extinctions of a big predator that we can actually trace to a specific human activity, and the activity was entertainment. Rome did not need lions for anything. It killed them in enormous numbers, over hundreds of years, in order to watch. By the time the empire ended, the lion was gone from Europe, gone from the Mediterranean coast of Africa, and retreating everywhere else. And precisely as it disappeared, it became more popular than it had ever been. The kings of medieval Europe kept lions, at enormous expense, in menageries. The Tower of London held them from the 13th century onward, and it held them for something close to 600 years, which means that for 6 centuries there was almost always a lion living in the middle of London. In 1937, workmen clearing the Tower moat found lion skulls. They were radiocarbon dated much later, placing them in the 13th to 15th centuries, and analysis identified them as Barbary lions from North Africa. Those animals had been captured in the Atlas Mountains, shipped across the Mediterranean and up the Atlantic coast, and kept in a stone enclosure in a cold northern city so that people who would never see the animal in the wild could see one. And then something happened that has no real parallel with any other species. The lion became a national symbol for countries that did not have lions. England put 3 of them on its royal arms. Scotland put 1 on a red field. So, in one form or another, did the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Norway, Finland, Bulgaria, Spain, Bohemia, Montenegro, Sri Lanka, Singapore, Ethiopia, Persia, and dozens more, in flags and crests and seals and coins. Almost none of those places had wild lions. Most of them never had. The English put a lion on the shield of a country where no lion had ever set foot, and they did it because by then, the lion had stopped being an animal and become an idea, and the idea traveled perfectly well without the animal attached to it. A heraldic lion is not a picture of a lion, it is a picture of what a lion means. And it turned out that the meaning could survive and spread and multiply across an entire continent long after every real lion on that continent was dead. Meanwhile, the real ones were running out. The Asiatic lion had once ranged from Greece through the Middle East and across northern India as far as Bengal. By the 19th century, hunting under both Mughal and later British rule had reduced it to fragments, and by the beginning of the 20th century, the entire subspecies was confined to a single patch of dry forest in the west of India called Gir. The figures for how low it went are disputed, and the lowest ones are probably too low. But the range of estimates for the early 20th century runs from around 20 animals to perhaps 100, and either way, the species was a handful of individuals away from ending. What saved it was the Nawab of Junagadh, the ruler of the small princely state that contained the forest, who banned lion hunting on his land and enforced it. His motives were not modern conservation, and he continued to permit favored guests to shoot the occasional animal. It did not matter, the protection held long enough. There are now somewhere in the region of 600 to 700 Asiatic lions, all of them in and around Gir, all of them descended from that remnant. It is one of the genuine recoveries in the history of large predators, and it happened because of a local ruler's decree in a state that no longer exists. Elsewhere, the ending was cleaner. The Barbary lion of North Africa, the animal from the Roman arenas and the Tower of London moat, was hunted out of the Atlas Mountains through the 19th and early 20th centuries. The last confirmed shooting of a wild one is usually placed in Morocco in the 1920s, though there is scattered evidence that a few survived in remote country for some decades after that. Either way, it is gone. The Cape lion of southern Africa was gone by the middle of the 19th century. And the lions that remain, the ones in East and Southern Africa that most people now think of as simply lions, have gone through a collapse in living memory that is not widely understood. Estimates for African lion numbers a century ago are frequently given as around 200,000. That figure is poorly sourced and should be held loosely. What is not in doubt is the direction and the scale of what has happened since, because the modern surveys are solid. The current wild population is somewhere in the region of 20 to 25,000 animals, and the species has lost something over 90% of the range it held historically. An animal that once lived from Britain to Peru, from Greece to Bengal, from the Cape to Siberia, now occupies scattered fragments of one continent and one forest in India. The most famous lions of the modern era, though, are two males who killed people, and their story is worth telling because of how it was corrected. In 1898, on the Uganda Railway in what is now Kenya, construction of a bridge over the Savo River was halted because two maneless male lions were taking workers out of the camps at night, repeatedly, over a period of about 9 months. Work stopped. Hundreds of laborers left. The engineer in charge, John Henry Patterson, eventually shot both animals and later wrote a book about it in which he stated that they had killed 135 people. That number was repeated for a century. In 2009, researchers analyzed the chemical signature preserved in the lion's bone and hair, which records what an animal has been eating over the last years of its life. Human tissue leaves a distinctive trace. The analysis suggested that the two lions together had eaten something in the region of 35 people, not 135. 35 people is still 35 people, but the same work pointed at something else. One of the lions had severe dental disease, a damaged jaw, and a broken tooth root. The kind of injury that makes taking normal prey extremely painful and slow prey much more attractive. The most famous man-eating lions in history were probably not demons, and probably not exceptional. One of them very likely had toothache. Step back and look at the whole shape of it. An animal that spread further than almost any land mammal has ever spread, across 3 continents and into a 4th. Watched closely enough by the first modern humans in Europe that they drew its hunting posture correctly on a cave wall 30,000 years ago, carved into mammoth ivory as a lion-headed man in what is the oldest surviving object anyone ever made of a thing that does not exist. Then set beside every god of power in every civilization that had one within reach, released from boxes in front of an Assyrian king so that a wall could be carved showing him defeating it, shipped across the Mediterranean by the hundred to die in Roman sand for a crowd that pitied the elephants and never once pitied the lions, kept in a stone pit in London for 600 years, painted onto the shields of countries that had never had one and could not have had one, and all the way through, quietly, retreating, out of Europe by the Roman period, out of North Africa's coast a few centuries later, out of the Middle East, out of India except for one forest, out of 9/10 of everywhere else within about 150 years. The lion is the most depicted animal in human history and one of the most reduced. The next time you see a lion on a flag, or on a crest above a door, or stamped on a coin, or standing in stone outside a bank or a museum or a courthouse, in a country that has never had one, understand what you are looking at. That is not decoration. That is the oldest idea our species ever had about power, still in use, thousands of years after we borrowed it, on buildings belonging to people who have never heard one. There are lions on the flags of nations across 3 continents. There are fewer than 25,000 of them left alive in the wild. We kept the symbol, and we spent the animal. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe and leave a comment telling me which part of the lion's history you never knew. And give the video a like so more people can find it. There is another one coming, and it is already moving.